Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the next MedTech Europe webinar. The topic of today's webinar is post-market activities and reports. I'm happy to have with me Dr. Philippe Auclair, Senior Director of Regulatory Strategy and Advocacy in Abbott Laboratories, who will deliver the webinar. After the presentation, we'll have questions and answer session, so please send me your questions to my mailbox. And Philippe, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Casper, and thanks MedTech Europe for organizing this forum and exchange of information. It's a very useful tool that MedTech Europe is establishing here. So for today, we will review a few slides which were developed by the Post-Market Surveillance Working Group as a basic introduction on how to comply with the requirement of the MDR. So the objective of this module, introduction module or training module, it's the result of discussion and analysis made by the group, by the MedTech Europe working group. This is not an official document. This is not something that you will be able to refer to when auditing by a notified body. It's a current interpretation, and it's provided for reference only. What really is the most valuable is to go back and consult the actual text of the regulation. Also, one point to be remembered is that even if the legislative text is final, there's numerous guidance for implementation which will clarify the requirements. And at this stage, they are not all available or not available when this presentation is made. So this is a snapshot of the situation as we speak, but this situation will evolve as we move ahead, and the Commission guidance will be made available. One of the most important requirements of this new regulation in the post-market arena is a requirement to establish a post-market surveillance plan for each device or each family of device. So this plan should define the data which are to be analyzed, and it needs to be established for each family, for each device or similar device which are on the market. It basically covers four elements: the post-market system governance, how it is established, how it works, and this is embedded into the quality management system. The PMS data collection, what kind of data will be processed and will be gathered. The post-market data analysis, how the manufacturer intend to review and process the data to reach an assessment of the benefit-risk ratio. And finally, the safety and performance assessment, which confirms the conformity assessment which was done at the time of the placing on the market. The text emphasizes also the dynamic nature of the follow-up, and that's what you can see on this slide. This is not, despite its name, an only post-market collection of data, but this is a system which needs to cover all the life cycle of the device. So if you look at this slide, which is given courtesy of notified body BSI, you can see at the bottom the life cycle of the device, I would say from cradle to grave, from the left-hand side, where you have the concept of the device towards the placing of the market, and eventually to the right, the obsolescence. And the post-market plan covers all these elements from the design to the obsolescence of the device. If you see, for example, the design and development, which is the early stage of conception, even at this stage, you have an input of the future post-market plan with, for example, clinical evaluation plan, and this plan should include elements to be covered, to be gathered in terms of assessing the safety of the product at an early stage. So this you also have going further during production and post-market, the post-market follow-up, and the evaluation which goes on during the entire life cycle, and production of a series of reports such as the PSUR, the PMS report, the vigilance report, and we will go a little bit more in depth on this report and their use in the next few slides. So what you can see here exemplify, it's a graphical rendition of the post-market surveillance plan, and it exemplifies the production of the various reports and the organization that you need to put in place. So the banner at the top is this post-market surveillance plan that we have reviewed, and it includes the post-market clinical follow-up plan, which is approved by the notified body, and its output, which is the post-market clinical follow-up report. From here, it is distilled in a series of reports which periodicity is based on the risk classification of the device. And what is really interesting to note is the interdependence and the overlap of these reports, and that should certainly drive their production internally. So from the post-market surveillance plan, you drill down to all classes of device that need to have a clinical evaluation report. And for class 1, you also need the post-market surveillance reports. Now, if you deal with higher class device, such as class 2, class 3, or implants, then you need a periodic safety update report, which is to be loaded into UDAMED. And we'll drill a bit on that in the next few slides. For high-risk device as well, class 2, class 3, you also need a summary of safety of performance, which is published in UDAMED and available to the general public. So this gives just a broad overview of the universe of these reports. And as I said, the interdependence and overlap is one of the trick factors that we need to consider. In the next few slides, and don't be worried, I will not read the screen here, but we will review extract of the medical device regulation and emphasize some of the attributes of each of these reports we have mentioned. So here what you have is the clinical evaluation report. This is the report that supports the conformity assessment, and it needs to include clinical and non-clinical data coming from testing methods, for example, and need to be included in the technical documentation. There's a specific periodicity here on this report, which depends on the risk classification of the device. For class 3 and class 2 and implants, we have an annual production of these reports. And for the other classes of device, less risky device defined by their classification, this is a 2 to 5 years production and update of this CAR. The next one is a clinical investigation report. So truly speaking, it's more a clinical affair report. It's not, truly speaking, a post-market report, but it needs to be processed and analyzed with the clinical evaluation reports. So as you can see, it describes two different bits that need to be produced. The first one is the investigation report itself, which need to be produced in the 1 year following the completion of the clinical investigation. There are also provisions for an early production of this report in case the study is stopped on safety grounds. But also, if you look down to the relevant article of the MDR, you will see that there is a summary of this clinical investigation report, which need to be written to be understandable by the user of the product and need to be made available through UDAMED. So it's in a sense clinical affair report, but it needs to be processed and analyzed, as the result will feed the clinical evaluation report. Coming next is the post-market clinical evaluation report. The PMCF plan itself needs to be approved by the notified body and to be proportionate with the risk of the device. The results are processed in what is called the post-market clinical follow-up evaluation reports. So this report will feed some of the other reports we reviewed, such as the CER, the clinical evaluation report. It also will be the basis of the summary of safety and performance. For implantable and class 3, these reports need to be updated at least annually. So the at least is not defined in the regulation, but need to be clarified by procedure in terms of threshold for revision. Another one is a summary of safety and clinical performance. This is a document which will be made publicly available via EUDAMED. It's for class 2 and class 3. For class 3 and implants, it needs to be reviewed annually, which is certainly to be considered in terms of maintenance cost for workload. The content is defined in the text, overlaps in part with some of the other reports we've seen. There is currently comitology process by the Commission which has started to standardize this report and define its format and content. So it's a bit early at this stage to draw a conclusion, but a format will be made available before EUDAMED is established. Moving next to the risk management report. So the risk management reports cover the entire lifetime of the device. It's required as a risk management plan for each device covering the known and foreseeable hazards. And for this one, it's a systematic update. So systematic update needs as well that we need to define threshold for revision, and it needs to be periodically reviewed for update. Well, some considered, and we in the group consider, that this report is the mother and the father of all the other reports, to the extent that it confirms the validity of the conformity assessment in regard to the benefit risk of the device. So it is an important part of the post-market. Post-market surveillance report it's special for class 1. This one, it's when necessary, not uploaded into EUDAMED, but need to be made available to the competent authority. You know that the competent authority are in charge of market surveillance, and specifically for class 1, which are for the most part self-certified. They play a role in surveying their national market. So this report needs to exist, to be updated when necessary and made available to them. What we can anticipate is that we will have a significant increase in the number of local audits carried out by the authority under the medical device regulation. And this local audit can be random or review of specific classes of devices, or they can be for cause if the authority are alerted by a certain number of events of vigilance reports which seem to indicate that there may be an issue with a specific product or class of device. We're going to an end with this report, so don't worry. This is the last one, which is the periodic safety update report, also known as PSUR. So this report is required for class 3 and 2B to be updated at least annually, which is here as well a significant burden. It's also required for class 2A, where it needs to be updated every 2 years. If you read the text on the right-hand side, or better even go to the directive itself, the text here is just an extract, you will see that there's a vast overlap in the content of this PSUR with the benefit risk reports, with the finding of the post-market clinical follow-up, with the summary of the post-market plan, and this certainly is one of the complexity of all this setup. This report PSUR will have to be uploaded into UDAMED by the notified body for class 3 and 2B. Here as well, comitology is underway. A group under the auspices of the Commission and MHRA UK has started defining a guide for production of PSUR. One of the interesting points is that even if we have all this overlap between reports, the authority and the Commission consider that these PSUR need to be a standalone report. So in other words, it cannot refer through reference, hyperlink with the other reports which have been issued, but it needs to include them or the relevant extract of them, which will require, in terms of production, significant resources for the workload, and most essentially, a very good communication between companies, since each of the reports will not be produced by the same individual or by the same department. Also, and even if this is not the specific focus point of this presentation, we need to mention vigilance as well. Vigilance is part of the post-market surveillance, and the collection and reporting of adverse events and eventual filing to the authority still exist under the MDR, with some notifiable modification. So we need to note that the filing of report has been modified. Instead of filing an adverse event report to the country where the event occurred, the filing will be done now to the central UDAMED, which is a major change. The second change is the timeline for reporting. The reporting of serious incidents, which currently under the directive is 30 days, will be reduced to 15 days. So this may sound trivial, but in fact there's a lot of implication, since the reduction from 30 to 15 days will reduce the time left for analysis of the event, and is likely to result in a considerable increase of the number of initial reports which will have to be filed. And this needs to be analyzed for each of the product category, because the analysis process differs vastly if you have glucose meter which is used by patient, or if you have a pacemaker which is used in setup in an hospital setup. So work to be done internally to assess the increase of workload. Now that we've reviewed all this report, and I hope that you're still awake after all this review, here is the takeaway slide. If you need to have one slide that you need to print and post on your office desk, this is this one. It is a recap of the main reports which are to be produced, which is the periodicity for each of them for the classification of the device. So these are the main reports. You see them. I will not read completely this. I think it's self-explanatory when you will look at it, but it will enable you to strategize, given your product portfolio, which class, and be able to plan in terms of production report under the MDR when they are needed, which periodicity for review. So I think this is an important slide, takeaway slide. Now, the complexity, and I'm sure you came to the conclusion at this stage of the presentation, is number one, the overlap of the various reports. As we've seen, these reports which are separate and need to be produced and sent to different entities are vastly overlapping. Number two, the periodicity of each of the reports is not the same. So this creates a challenge to maintain the various reports in full synchrony. So when you produce a PSUR, to make sure that you have included the latest information of the clinical evaluation reports, and so on and so on. So internally, we probably have different teams or different individuals in charge of the production of these reports, and this will require a considerable carefulness in terms of communication internally, so that these reports can be in synchrony and will not be at odds with each other. This is another rendition of this report, which was produced by the Post-Market Surveillance Working Group. You can see here how they interact with each other and how they feed the post-market system. We have identified 6 which are numbered here in this slide, and we brainstorm on how we can maintain compliance and what could be the early initiative that can be taken during the transition phase so that we can plan for compliance with these reports. So this second part and final part of the presentation will be a review of this initial activity for the 6 pressure points, I would say, that have been defined here. Well, first pressure point, it's the clinical evidence throughout the device life cycle. And I refer to some of the first slide of this presentation when we define the cradle-to-grave need to control safety throughout the life cycle. So what we came up with this brainstorming is really to analyze and identify the connection between the life cycle activity and the quality management system, specifically with the generation of clinical evidence, PMCF, post-market surveillance, the maintenance of the technical documentation. So all that is done. I mean, this is clear from the discussion of the group, but it may not be presented in the way that it will require to be done in the MDR, and it may not be fully linked one with each other. A second point, just emphasize this one, which is the establishing the linkage mechanism between all these plans, the risk management plan, clinical evaluation, post-market clinical follow-up, and how they feed into the technical documentation to be maintained through the life cycle of the device. Establishing a yearly assessment of the clinical evaluation report, specifically for Class 3, something that we believe is key to be planned. This is not a cost for obtaining the MDR. This is a maintenance cost, and the workload should be identified and built into the product maintenance cost well ahead of the MDR. And also, we believe as a group that the risk management plan is in fact the overarching document, and that all documents feed this one and need to make sure that they are interlinked. Post-market system. Well, for the post-market system, we need to identify what changes will be required, identifying the gaps between what is done now and what is required by the PMS system as we define it. Specifically, to make sure that the link with the documented procedure for executing its element under the quality management system is very well defined. And the PMS system should become a very prominent part of the quality management system that needs to be reviewed at each management review. A couple of other points which have been identified, which may be slightly different, have to do with the creation of the position of the person responsible for regulatory compliance and the role of this person in the PMS system. and the complaint handling. The job description should be created or updated if it exists, so that the QMS should fulfill the requirement of the new regulation. The time schedule for update of the reports need to be defined, and you can refer at the takeaway slide we reviewed before. This is very dependent on the portfolio of your product. If you have class 1, class 2, or class 3, or implants, this will drive a very different pattern of report production and resources required. Again, a strategic portfolio management is needed, so an analysis of what product will be carried over from the MDD to the MDR and what workload will be associated with the post-market requirement is something that needs to be carefully established to make sure that the system can be maintained. And again, PMS should be established as a high-level procedure in the QMS. PMS plan. Well, we need a template for the PMS plan. To the best of our intelligence, and we may be wrong-footed later, but there's no plan with the Commission to establish a template for PMS plan. So each company will have to define its own. The plan should be product by product or by product family. How you define product and product family depends certainly on your product portfolio. It could be, for example, each product listed on a single certificate. This is at least what we would anticipate. And it needs to establish the trigger for revising the report. Some of the reports are revised on a ad hoc basis or when needed, and it needs to be procedurized that the company has established the trigger and the threshold for revision of the document. Identifying a sequence of creating a PMS plan, new template for the portfolio, creating or updating PMS plan and incorporating the plan into the technical document. No matter what class of product you have, the technical documents need now to include this PMS plan, and map with the existing plan, realizing that we're not starting from scratch here. We do most of what is required, but we need to create the feeds so that the PMS plan can be updated on a regular basis. PMSR, PSUR, reviewing the current report of PMS activity against the requirements. This is part of the overall gap assessment, which we believe should be done rapidly throughout the transition period. Create the template for the report. Well, we've mentioned, for example, that PSUR and PSUR is going through a comitology process with the Commission, so we will have a fixed report. But this is important. Establishing the level of details. I mean, the devil is in the detail. We probably should err towards giving the information requires and not more information, so that the workload is manageable for us. It in part will depend on the output of the comitology group on PSUR, defining the guide and the format. Create procedure. So we need to have procedure which will be audited by the notified body on the creation of these reports. Estimation of the workload and number of reports here as well has to do with the product portfolio composition. Depending on whether you carry low risk, high risk, the workload will be very different and should be built, and I may sound as a broken record here, but should be built as a maintenance cost, because if these reports are not produced, the product will not be able to be maintained on the market after the date of application. establishing timeline for creating the reports, and confirming the availability of necessary resources. This confirm some of the elements that we have reviewed in the composition of this report. Complaint and vigilance. As we've seen, there are changes which stems from the modality of filing and the timeline for submission, and there need to be a careful review of our existing procedure against the procedure as they will be audited under the MDR to identify gaps. There's this interesting request for trending, which apply to the non-reportable event in the medical device regulation. And the only requirement is that a significant increase trigger reporting. So significant increase will have to be defined in terms of frequency and severity. And this is not described in the regulation and to be defined internally by each manufacturer, depending on the risk class of their device. Well, due to the change and specifically the reduction of the time for filing from 30 days to 15 days, there need to be an assessment of the workload. We anticipate a vast increase in the number of initial vigilance reports, but these need to be assessed. And this can be done by a review of a sample of complaint reports. Here, apologies, the text, a vigilance report. It's actually event report, complaint reports, to assess them through the decision tree of the new MDR and to estimate what is the likely increase in reports. This will vastly depend on the product category, from the first gap assessments that have been made by some of the MedTech Europe members. It may vary from a 20 to 50% increase for some of the product to a more than 300% increase of initial reports if, for example, the product is a consumer product which is used directly by patients. So I just encourage you to be very proactive here and start assessing what the future will lie in for you and what will be the consequences, because it implies resources for vigilance reporting, and the future workload need to be estimated. We need to identify the change that need to be processed in the complaint handling and the timeline for their implementation. This is important, and to ensure consistency of the data provided to the competent authority with the other reports. Some of this information will be in, just say, for example, the PSUR, and we need to make sure that the data are compatible, coordinated, and in synchrony, because discrepancy between the data may lead to further question from the authority. And finally, this is my last slide in this training from the post-market working group, is the electronic submission. Big change for us. This is UDEMED. I'm sure that you are very familiar with the various activity ongoing with UDEMED. In terms of PMS, we need to establish the mechanism to feed UDEMED to make sure that we include the timeline and the interface. It's probably still a bit early, as the specification of the post-market module of UDEMED have hardly started being discussed. But this is something which is very important for the day-to-day activity and filing of vigilance report and the various reports. And our internal procedure within each manufacturer need to be established. They should include the responsibility, the authority for this electronic submission, who will have authority to open the UDEMED section, who will file them, who will prepare them. So there is a new area of procedure and responsibility that we did not have before, which will have to be considered. Also, we may want to consider one-time submission of all the data. This is something that may or may not be possible, depending on how the various reports will be required. And here I refer to the comitology groups which are working on the specification. But we see that once it's electronic submission, if we can have a one-time submission, it would be an improvement on the operability of the system. We have a lot to learn on and benchmark from the pharma company. So if in your industry you have some of your peers which have been active in pharma, they do have database which are, I wouldn't say similar, but based on the same operating principles. So there is a lot to be learned on their procedure process. Also, we have the UDI, Unique Device Identifier, for which we have some experience from FDA, which we may want to try to leverage in the European environment. Lastly, communication. Communication and the involvement of the IT department, or what is information technology, will be essential. A manual submission to EUDAMED, especially if you have a large portfolio of product, will rapidly become unmanageable. And there is a need that all this procedure is automatized and the feeds are really created into the electronic submission. So this concludes this very short presentation and introduction on the PMS requirement of the MDR. The slide will be made available by MedTech Europe on their intranet. We have left off some time for the Q&A, but please realize that most of the implementing guidance are not yet available to date, and we may have to wait for some months before we have more clarity. But at this stage, I want to thank you for your patience and attention, and I think we will open the floor for questions.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Philip, for this comprehensive presentation. And let's move to the questions and answer session, and we'll try to answer questions we received from our members.
Yes, we have one question here on, and I read the question. How long does a PSUR need to be submitted? And this is really a very good question, which has been at the center, or maybe not at the center, but has been discussed in the PSUR comitology group, unfortunately to date without formal conclusion. The PSUR is to be produced and submitted during the lifetime of the device. So stating that only displaces the issue, because it comes to the definition of what is the lifetime of the device. And MedTech Europe have proposed a definition which is being considered by this group, but at this stage we do not have a formal conclusion on this part. Yes, we had some other question we received, and that was prior to the webinar. Actually, I can cover a couple of those. The first one is, what happens if EUDAMED is not ready by the date of application, and how will we file the post-market surveillance and vigilance reports? So, I mean, the solution is in part built into the medical device regulation. If you look at the article 120 on transition and 123, until EUDAMED is ready, and EUDAMED may be late, until EUDAMED is ready, the relevant provision of exchange of information, including the vigilance reporting, will follow those of the directives. So take, for example, the issue of vigilance reports. If EUDAMED is not ready, they will not be able, the individual vigilance reports will not be able to be filed centrally through the database. So until EUDAMED is up and running, they still will be filed to the country of occurrence individually as per the provision of the MDD. Okay, we have a question here that just arrived. Let me read it. Does the risk management has to be performed for each device, or it be performed for device category of device? This is a very good question. Most of the regulation verbiage refer to device. So the PMS plan need to be done by device. Now, our current interpretation is that we probably can extend that to device family, and this is to be discussed further with essentially notified bodies. There is a group, the NBMed, where the question has been placed. My personal view and the view of the group, which have discussed on that, is that we need to enlarge it. Doing it for single device would be very onerous and probably not worth the effort. Product family, how can we define product family? One of the easiest way will be to define them by the certificates. The product which would be listed on a single product certificate would be considered as a family or a variant, but this is ongoing discussion. Okay, we have another one that we received here. What about devices which will benefit from the grace period? So let's backtrack a bit here for those who may not be familiar. The transition of the medical device regulation is 3 years. It comes to an end with the date of application, which will be in May 2020. Now, there is an extension during which a product which will be approved under the old regime, MDD, can carry on being placed on the market for a further 4 years, but this product needs to fulfill some requirements. And specifically, as of the date of application, May 26, 2020, which is the trigger date, all the provision of the post-market aspect of the MDR need to be applied. So it means that even if your product is certified under the directive, if you still maintain this product on the market after May 2020, you will need to apply the vigilance requirement with the new timeline, with the filing to EUDAMED. You also will need, depending on the product class, to produce the reports which are required, including the PSUR report and the SFCP report. For the floor. Yeah, one question we had as well, which we already partly discussed, is all these new, let me read it, all these new reports to be produced, PSUR, CER, PMCF, overlaps. To avoid overlaps, can one be considered the mother report and reference the other reports? Well, this indeed is what would be our recommendation. This is what the group advocated to the various comitology group, even to the extent that, for example, a PSUR would be just a compilation of hyperlink, which would send to the appropriate EUDAMED feed to the other reports. This is still to be discussed. For PSUR, it is clear that authority would not accept to have cross-reference to reports when preparing the PSUR. This is a view which may sound a bit extreme, which stems from the fact that within Ministry of Health authority and competent authority, this report will not be reviewed by the same department and the same individual, and they just don't consider that it can simply reference the available approach, and we should probably start thinking about a modular approach by which the report should be comprehensive on their own, but would include extract of the other module, which would be kept in synchrony.
Okay, thank you very much, Philip, and thank you to all the participants. I will keep you posted about the next MedTech Europe webinars, and the slides and the recorded version of this webinar will be available on our intranet. I will send email to all the participants later this afternoon. Once again, thank you very much.